So next I want to introduce, to bring Hudson Worlsey into the conversation. We had so the good fortune of getting a small amount of money from the New South Wales and the federal government to develop a piece of work looking at, what are those best practice levers overseas that could help to really drive decarbonisation of materials, looking at across a range of different areas. So Hudson, I'll hand it over to you now. Thanks.
Thanks, Monica. Great. I'll try and share my screen now. All right. So this is putting a research hat on and doing a dive into the international policy frameworks around the world. We were wanting to find out what's being done, what's emerging, and what can we learn from here in Australia across our levels of government. So the scope was to investigate what's out there. The good news is, if you're a policymaker, you're not alone. You needn't start from scratch by any means. It's an emerging field, so you do have the opportunity to shape a framework for real action. The research was done by Monica Richter, who's our chair today, Alex Nasser and Belinda Whelan from Climate Kick. Big thank you to them. And I did some work as well. It was actually a lot of work. I'm going to have to fly to cover it in 10 minutes. So excuse the brevity. I've asked that a link to the report gets into the chat while I'm talking, so you can dive into the detail, and everything that's referenced in there, of course, has a hyperlink at the end. And there's also a glossary of all of the many acronyms. In a nutshell, this is a relatively new and emerging field. It's getting busy. We know, that's why we're here, that this is complex, the task is complex, and that the construction ecosystem itself is highly complex. So we're dealing with complexity. As Monica mentioned, this work was funded through the federal government, the former Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, and its major projects implementation team in its interjurisdictional program. All right. At the highest level, government is a driver of change, can be a driver of change. So procurement policies that reward and require embodied carbon reductions through low emission construction materials and practices, that leads to a race to the top. Government can also be an enabler of change. So supporting the development of the tools, the taxonomy laws, inventories and calculators, and independent verified databases can help support skills, the professions, trades and research, and support the transition to a circular economy. How do we do the work? Well, we spoke with 17 carbon policy practitioners, experts in the field. We identified 14 voluntary and 8 mandatory policy mechanisms from 3 key regions. Interestingly, when you consider voluntary schemes versus regulation, the USA, we found 10 voluntary policies and none mandatory. In Europe, we found 1 voluntary and 5 mandatory schemes of note. And in the Asia Pacific, it was 3 all. A note on language. If you're wanting to look into this field, policies that address embodied carbon and the tools, the levers, are not necessarily labelled as such. We identified a variety of terminology tailored to suit the policy environment in which it's being developed. So in the EU, we heard about material conservation. The C40, the collection of large cities around the world, talk about clean construction. And in the USA, it's buy clean. So language obviously suits where it's spoken, but just note that if you're looking for this, it doesn't always come with the obvious label of embodied carbon. As the map shows, USA, Europe and Asia Pacific were our areas of focus. This diagram attempts to paint the landscape, not in an artistic way. Apologies that it's pretty, it's pretty functional. But on the left, you can see at the highest level, global, the national, state, these are the scale of influence down to project, product and material. The vertical orange arrows really show what span a policy or a tool has in its focus. So emissions reporting is from national down to a company. Net zero targets, again, national down to a company. But if you're looking at low emission technology grants, well, in Australia, that'd be delivered by ARENA, Australian Renewable Energy Agency, and they focus at project and product level. Research and development, also product and material level. And then government procurement that I championed, that has effect at national down to project level. So if you do download the report, dive into this to get a feeling of where tools operate and the breadth and depth of their effectiveness. So we found 5 groupings. Policies and programs can be identified, grouped into 5 categories. Policy levers to drive the market, the role of industry and the market, that's us today, rating schemes for building performance, procurement, that's government as an enabler of change, and then the data, tools and skills needed to get to net zero. Let's dive into the first one. So policy levers to drive the market. Carbon pricing. I know that's political kryptonite, but nonetheless, it is effective. And it's of interest to us. The European Union's carbon pricing scheme is effective. And for us, that's the carbon border adjustment mechanism we need to be aware of for exports as they impose a carbon tax on materials from jurisdictions that don't have a carbon price. We also saw rebates in California, in New York. That can be discounts on property tax or rebates depending on the level of certification achieved in a building. So an incentive to build greener. There are green loans and grants, as I mentioned. There are tools to overcome a green premium. Initially, the first uptake of these new materials can have a cost premium, doesn't always, but can, and a carbon contract for difference. A financial derivative can come into its own there. Organisations like the Carbon Leadership Forum in the US, really pushing design optimisation and substitution of carbon intensive materials around dematerialisation and building smarter. And MECLA had an event recently on pre-design for that building smarter component of the puzzle. We saw taxonomy laws as very useful. In the EU, the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy defines what is a green, clean asset or asset class. And in Australia, the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute is developing a taxonomy for our context. The circular economy, supporting that transition in the EU, we've seen the Circular Economy Action Plan. At a city level, Greater London Authority has a circular economy guidance, which includes embodied carbon. And closer to home in New Zealand, there's the Building for Climate program, which includes investments in resource recovery for construction and demolition waste materials. The next grouping of activities, role of industry and the market. I've got many of you will recognise some of the logos there on the left. I've touched on the Carbon Leadership Forum already, but the Rocky Mountain Institute, World Green Building Council, its Australian equivalent, the Green Building Council of Australia, the Building Research Establishment in the UK, C40 Cities, and its Clean Construction Forum. There's the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, Building Transparency, also out of the US. And in Singapore, we had quite a number of examples of innovation and policy work by the Building and Construction Authority. So many organisations that are collaborative, bringing industry and the market to government for co-design of the frameworks for change. One activity is helping industry calculate embodied carbon, and we learnt of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors who are working on that in the UK. They also have a presence here in Australia. Carbon Leadership Forum, I mentioned, they have their carbon benchmark study started in 2017, also looking at the calculations. One point from the Singapore example, their government and through the Building and Construction Authority really investing in R&D to see their buildings remain globally competitive, see that as a point of international competitive advantage, which since 2007 has resulted in 1,000 green rated buildings. So getting a dividend. Number 3 is rating mechanisms. Peter mentioned several of them, the neighbours scheme. Internationally, there's also BREEAM and LEED and others. We saw rating schemes can be used as an early intervention, providing an incentive. In Arizona, we heard of review times for private sector buildings being cut, as long as the proposed building has lower embodied carbon and is less energy intensive. Easing design constraints for buildings that voluntarily fulfill ratings was something that we saw in Florida. These are mechanisms at government's disposal. We also heard that to have your rating mechanisms for performance must have trusted sources of data. The Built Environment Carbon Database being worked on in the UK was a good example of that. Procurement, I mentioned that's the big lever from government. Setting a pledge, the C40 cities, their city construction forum, Clean Construction Forum, is seeking to influence its cities to start offering to requiring a pledge. In the UK, the required pledge to win public works for organisations to demonstrate they're on a path to net zero by 2050 to be eligible for those public works. So the final point, data, tools and skills. There are common databases being built in the Netherlands, in UK, USA, Denmark, Sweden and Finland. Be good to have one here. Building software also being developed and calculators in Scotland, elsewhere in the UK, the Netherlands, the USA. And obviously accredited training courses demonstrate that government's serious about embodied carbon and can apply a level of standard to the education to satisfy government requirements. Finally, and I'm having to rush, I apologise, but this is emerging, as I said, the new policies, every month this slide gets busier. We've seen the Climate Bill become the Climate Act. Thank you, Peter, for setting out some of the highlights there. Climate Active, for climate neutral buildings, has signalled that embodied energy from construction materials may be in future iterations. New South Wales Government has released the Sustainable Building SEP, State Environmental Planning Policy, and Infrastructure New South Wales has released a discussion paper on decarbonising infrastructure delivery. Really recommend that sets out almost a how-to in a pathway, but very practical way. And across the Tasman in New Zealand, we're seeing the whole of life embodied carbon assessment, a technical method for homes and other built forms. So it's exciting that this is an emerging space. We're also seeing increasing ambition, as was mentioned. Australia now has increased emission reduction targets. Victoria has come out strongly with higher renewable targets and overall state emissions. And the New South Wales government, following COP27 in Glasgow, took our 2030 targets from 2035 from 35% to 50% by 2030 against the 2005 benchmark. So the ratchet is coming. It's an emerging policy field. It's an exciting policy field because it can have real effect. And as we heard from Peter, there's going to be such a challenge. We need, on one hand, to build all this enabling infrastructure, but at the same time, decoupling emissions and that economic growth, even when it's for vital infrastructure required for the transition. So that's it. Thank you, Monica. I'll hand back to you.